Smart cities. Everyone is obsessed with them, from visions of autonomous cars and flying service drones to everything being connected through billions of IoT devices constantly reporting activity. This has long been the mantra of what smart cities are supposed to be. But being honest, this concept is something I've somewhat struggled with. The best cities are those that are people-centric, focused on making people's lives easier, healthier, more sustainable, and more productive. Sure, technology plays a role in this, but should it be at the center? Well, smart cities expert Meredith Hodgman joins the podcast to delve into this question and to help us all understand what a smart city really is.
You're listening to Smarter Cities, discussions on urban life and how it's changing around us, with Jason D'Souza.
Meredith Hodgman, welcome to Smarter Cities.
Hi, Jason. How are you doing?
So we were just saying it's Meredith without an E, correct? Meredith Hodgman without an E.
Yeah, there's no E in Hodgman, yeah.
There's no E in Hodgman. So there you go. So great to see you. How is lockdown treating you?
Pretty good, actually, Jason. I can't complain. A lot better than last year for a variety of reasons. So just being grateful for every moment that I can.
I know. I think most of us can say we're pretty lucky in Australia, where we might be in lockdown, but we still have extremely low levels of the virus, an extremely low death rate, as tragic as any death might be, but it's still low. And we have a supercharged vaccination program that seems to be outpacing anyone's expectations. So I agree with you. I think we're in a pretty good, if difficult, place.
I think we're both double vaccinated now, officially, aren't we?
Double vaccinated. And like you, I had a pretty sore arm afterwards, but it's a small price to pay. And one of the things is I sort of said to my wife, actually, after the second one, I felt a bit high after the second one. And she goes, and was it an enjoyable experience or not? And I said, I didn't want to tell her that it kind of was. Feeling a little bit, okay.
You need to get out a little bit more, Jason, I think.
Yeah, I know. Well, when you got young children, I'll take any entertainment I can get, right? So great time to be chatting about this. So, it's funny, this podcast is called Smarter Cities, and people often say to me, how come you haven't done anything on smart cities, right? You've talked to everyone from architects to designers, you've talked to people in other countries, you've done all sorts of really interesting topics, but you never actually talk about smart cities. And I said, why don't I get an expert who is an expert on smart cities on, and we'll have a talk about smart cities. So hence why we're talking to you, right? So I'm really keen on this topic. As you know, you and I had the privilege of speaking at a forum recently about smart cities and how you invest in them and what are they and all that. And it was a pretty interesting discussion. And I think, that audience was pretty educated, I think, on this. But most of my listeners are probably kind of wondering what all of this is really about and is it really a thing? That's why I wanted to have a chat to you. But before we get into that, how did you become an expert on smart cities?
I still laugh. People ask me, what do I do for a living? It's like there's always a small pause of, what do you say? I can't get away with saying I just work for the government any longer. I have to come up with some sort of tag around it.
I'm a consultant. That usually works quite well.
Yeah, that certainly is a conversation killer. Someone threw the term urban futurist at me the other day, and wow. I didn't have it, but...
Urban futurist. I've had a futurist on the show. Yeah, Nikki Greenberg. She came on.
Oh, yeah. I know. She's just moved back, hasn't she?
She has. She was out there in the US and, came back, and she's kind of, futurizing here now.
Well, the question, how did I become a smart city expert? For a long time in life, I used to think of myself as a jack of all trades and master of none. And it wasn't until about 7 years ago that it all sort of came together in some sort of reason or rhyme. I suppose for a lot of people who work in our sector, we've been working in this space for longer than we have been able to call it a sector. So at heart, we're all urbanists, really. So I might say futurists, but most of us came from very different walks of life. That's a multidisciplinary field. For me, I guess I found my passion working for the Victorian government, would you believe, in the policy and regulation branch of the legal division of the Department of Transport.
And I need to get out more?
It was the best job I ever had in my life. to date. At the time, our debt sec was Jim Betts, who your New South Wales listeners might know.
What a great man Jim Betts is. About to become the Secretary of New South Wales Premier in Cabinet.
I nominate Jim Betts to be next on your podcast.
That's a good idea, actually. I should get Jim on this podcast.
Anyone who loves infrastructure, music, sustainable transport is A-OK in my book.
You know what I really like about him, right, is that there's no pretenses about Jim. He when I was in government, you'd have meetings with the, very senior level meetings, and you'd be sitting in the senior meeting, and I'd be there in my suit and my crisp white shirt and my, suit, and Jim would turn up in a T-shirt, with Jim Morrison on it or something. It's not that bad. Yeah. But there was no pretenses about it.
He's famous for not wearing a tie in the box.
Yes.
And the manager I reported through to was probably enabled by Jim. He used to sort of encourage us to see if we could sneak Morrissey lyrics into policy and regulation or into Hansard.
That's such a Victorian thing, seriously.
So good. My humble role, to be honest, that was like one of my first jobs out of university, was to research best practice in international trends that would align transport and the planning portfolio, basically, for a sustainable future. That department changed governance structures, and they created entities, and they, really prioritized walking and cycling, etc. And, as a public service, we were all very well versed in articulating the cross-sectorial economic, social and environmental efficiencies that would come from this type of integration or an integrated city approach, whether that was to the visitor economy or to the health departments or to education, etc. But not once did you ever hear the word smart cities, So then I suppose fast forward 5 years, and I found myself with the opportunity to work for the head of corporate social responsibility for the MTR Corporation based in Hong Kong.
Oh, wow.
This absolutely brilliant human called Glenn Frommer. I think he might have been a rocket scientist at one point, and I'm pretty sure he had something to do with putting the ear on the mouse and all sorts of stuff like that. But there he was, running MTR Corporation's global social environmental policy, ESG policy, from Hong Kong. And by this point, digital and data was alive. It was clunky and it was expensive, but it was alive. And for us, it spelled the end of greenwashing. We had this long time in this, when we'd be trying to make things more sustainable, and we'd use evidence or we'd use economics, but we didn't have data. We didn't have a lot of things going behind us there. So we're able to sort of end that greenwashing trend in a sense, and modelling evidence-based decisions that could help us really demonstrate the ROI on interventions, the cost of inactions, etc. We didn't have real-time data at this point. And I think perhaps critically also, we didn't have the consumer demand for responsive online services that we have now either. So from Hong Kong, I moved into trade and investment, still focused on best practice and infrastructure.
Here in New South Wales?
I did. I moved back to Sydney.
Right.
Melbourne girl moved to Sydney, like Melbourne City's girl moved to Sydney. Horror.
It's a pretty big deal, right? It's hard for a Victorian to accept that Sydney is a place you should live in.
This was a grey T-shirt once upon a time. I just really clung to it. Oh, sorry, it was a black T-shirt once upon a time because I'm so Melbourneian, but now I'm in Sydney. Now I wear grey. You might want to edit that out.
Wow. Yeah, and I don't know what it is with Victorians, right? They never really recover from continuing to bash Sydney, even when they live in Sydney.
Yeah, I called myself an expat in Hong Kong, and now I consider myself an expat in Sydney.
Oh gosh, it's hilarious. Yeah, look, it's interesting you should say that. I think that's become more nuanced in this sort of COVID world where we're locking each other off, from borders. And I not to distract a little bit, but I'm a little concerned about it now. What used to be a gentle ribbing of one another on the sporting field, or a bit of a joke about Queenslanders or Tasmanians or something, right? Which was enjoyable, has now sort of become just a little bit unpleasant.
As a recovering public servant, one of the joys I think COVID's done is really educated a lot of Australians in the fact that we are a federation. I don't think people really understood, what state and federal government and indeed local government was responsible for. And not to be a complete nerd, but to bring it back to transport regulation. I was in a motorcycle accident a little while ago. And, I was a hit and run. And this unregistered Victorian woman ran me over. And there was absolutely nothing we could do about it without an extradition treaty.
Between states?
Yeah. You can't just take somebody from another state without an extradition type treaty thing.
I guess so, because they're different state police forces and different, of course.
Yeah. It was only till quite recently we had one single integrated driver's license system. And today I actually registered on mygov.com and I now have one single identity in Australia, like across Australia. That's unheard of, right?
Yeah, wow.
And thanks to the Digital Ministers Forum that came out of National Cabinet. To your point around hostility, a lot of, citizens being like, New South Wales started COVID to get second whatever. Like, actually, it's kind of, sovereign, your state has sovereignty. So if I can't, get my hit and run person out of your state, you also have the right to say, no, you can't come in. It's how it's always been.
Well, and I think there has been a real learning experience around the power of state administration in terms of service delivery versus the power of the Commonwealth as a federation and what the roles and responsibilities are of each level of government. And, people look to the Prime Minister. Why can't you order Premier X or Y to do this? Well, I'm sorry, Premier X is a duly elected leader of the state of X. And his or her responsibility is to the state of X, that they don't report to the Prime Minister. And their job under the Federation is to take care of healthcare, is to take care of policing, is to take care of state transportation. These are all state-based responsibilities. And I think it's been a shock to a lot of people as to how much power actually state administrations have. And they should have, because you would never argue that a bureaucrat in Canberra would be best placed to decide how to run a state public service or a state transport service, or because they're just not close enough to the ground of how these things operate. Just like you wouldn't ask a state official to decide how rubbish collection should work on the ground.
I love when the conversation's going in, and I hope we can tie it to place and metropolitan level governance soon. But to your question,
these are big words. These are big words.
To your question around, how did I end up in smart cities? I think we digressed around the point that I joined the federal government. I've now officially worked in 4 levels of government, Jason.
Wow, you are a brave woman.
Yeah, including intergovernmental, would you believe? Weird.
Gosh.
Local government is definitely the most political, most politicised. But from Hong Kong, I moved into trade and investment for the Australian Trade and Investment Commission. Still focused on best practice for infrastructure, but really focusing on Australia's competitive advantage for export and investment attraction. Helping SMEs and startups, and not like Lend-Lease needs a lot of help, but certainly, partnering and talking and working with Lend-Lease in various markets, etc., around Australia's offering for smart cities, which was really great. But at that point in time, the word smart cities was not uncommon. And it was really sort of this widget era. Korea had an underground waste vacuum system, and there were cities being risen up from the sand deserts in the Middle East out of nowhere with no people in them. And they were all sort of punctuated with advertisements for desktop widgets and sort of, disparate bouquets of applications, or the ever omnipresent command center. And they were all really high cost, low return toys. And this period created this poor brand image for smart cities, that name, that we will never shake off. That's my proposition, at least. But by this point, 2 things had happened, really. It's like 7 years ago. It was right before the Smart Cities and Suburbs program. And that is that business was leading the change in digital transformation. That's probably the first thing, driven by cost efficiencies primarily, but also this consumer demand for customised, personalised, and importantly, localised services. We saw a layer of information architecture mature, connect the dots, and then start to sort of utilise real-time information, which is what I said was missing a little earlier, I guess. And it really made the citizen feel like they were in control of how they interacted with and used, shopping, but also the physical world around them. And so in this role at Austrade and, presenting Australia's position globally on smart cities, part of the biggest challenge was bringing our capital cities along for the ride. Like, how do you tell the world that Australia's got great smart city expertise when most of the cities aren't sitting at the table? That before the Smart Cities and Suburbs program, most cities didn't have smart city strategies. Most local governments didn't have a digital transformation strategy. Most cities didn't even know what businesses were in their local government areas that had smart city expertise, let alone that were already globally leading exporters. Under Mayor Martin Hess and led by the vision of Peter Arpel, I'd say the City of Adelaide was the forerunner here by country mile in terms of database decision-making, integrated into service delivery and personalised citizen experiences. But for many cities, unless the mayor personally made it a priority, it just wasn't going to happen. In fact, it's pretty common for smart city agendas to be led out of the economic development team or the marketing teams, not the CIOs and not even transport, it's like these. So when the opportunity came for me to join the City of Sydney as the head of international engagement, I jumped on it. I really wanted to sort of bring the voice of the local government to the narrative, give international investors a better understanding about how to do business with Australian government because, like you said, there's this weird federational structure and, people, the way cities are structured in Australia is just so fundamentally different to overseas. Like we'd have people coming to the City of Sydney during the bushfire pandemic and desperately trying to sell us drones that could put bushfires out with water, with just zero understanding of the fact that the City of Sydney is not responsible for putting out bushfires, because in San Francisco, which is ultimately a bit of a quasi-police state, they are actually responsible for these types of elements. So, that demystification was a challenge. So I really jumped on board this opportunity to go to the City of Sydney. And at the same time, at that time, City of Sydney hadn't even published a smart city strategy yet. They were just about to. So it was exciting. And I also joined the Internet of Things Alliance Australia as the chair of the Smart Cities Workstream at the exact same time. So the IOTAA is the peak body for the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things, if people don't know what that is refers to small physical devices that are connected to the internet. They collect and they share data. And those things could be a vehicle, it could be your headphones, it could be a wearable device, et cetera, et cetera. So the data that comes out of it, the integration of that data, it all sort of comes together and can do all sorts of practical applications like livestock monitoring or crime reduction or digital health, fleet management, you name it. IoT devices enable it. And it's a really cool peak body, to be honest with you. Like most Industry 4.0 technologies, whether it's like, simulation technologies or additive manufacturing, etc., our peak bodies are new and we're all still discovering how to become peak bodies. So it's been really lovely to be a journey of that part. But what it did is take me from the ivory tower of government to more of a coalface type function where I could really focus and get excited about unpacking the importance of B2G collaboration, whether that was for procurement or for foreign direct investment or for the co-design of solutions. Ultimately, I believe it's the way government and businesses adapt and modernise that is shaping our ability to develop business models that will deliver the cities of the future. So then here I am today now at KPMG in our newly established infrastructure advisory in a small team called Places Plus Partnerships, which sort of is the culmination of all that.
A nice culmination. And look, I mean, what a fascinating career journey, right? And I'm glad you spent some time in my hometown, Hong Kong, which is, it is pretty advanced on a lot of tech, right? And interesting, I was reading an article in the SCMP, South China Morning Post, basically saying how Hong Kong is falling behind on tech. And I'm thinking, well, that's interesting. And they're saying, well, the Octopus card was invented 20 years ago. This is a card that, unlike our cards before, you could use your credit card or anything, you could already use as a stored value card to buy clothing, food, pay for a taxi, whatever. People were already in Hong Kong using that 20 years ago. And now you can just do that by credit card, right? Every system just does it or now you can just do it on your phone, on Apple Wallet or whatever. So so they were asking, well, what's the next series of tech? And I thought about that as well. And it's a good segue actually into this smart city thing, right? So I really like what you said around the fact that for a while there's been this whole conversation about widgets. And when I started looking in this space, when I was working in parts of our business that were looking at how do we actually get involved in more technological advancement, digital enhancement of our precincts and places, out of the woodwork came lots of widget sellers, right? So there was technology companies coming out of the woodwork everywhere. We've got this amazing thing. Look at it. It's amazing. And there's this thing and it does this. And okay. And then, here is another thing. And if you did this in your buildings, this would happen, right? And you look at it all and you go, okay, well, it's a really amazing piece of tech. But what is the purpose of it in terms of what is the commercial purpose of it? How does it add value to my business case for a particular building or my precinct? And what does it actually do for the citizen? And then you expand that more to the sort of government space, like the amount of, webinars and conferences, and whatever, around smart cities. And you listen to them say, well, this is my vision for a smart city. And what do you see in the smart city? You see a bunch of technology. You might see a charging station, or you might see a solar panel that's connected to a windmill that's connected to a battery charging station or something like that. But again, there's no unifying purpose behind any of that, apart from the fact that the tech looks cool, right? So what is this smart city thing? Is there a definition of it, or is it just us really getting excited about technology?
So there's so many definitions of smart cities, it's not even funny.
Yeah, that's why I asked you.
Definition, Smart Cities Council's got a definition, which is probably where the buck should stop. But what I just really feel like that becomes navel gazing. Ultimately, whenever you start the conversation, everybody needs to define it or redefine it, because they need to be a part of that definition process to feel like they are part of the solution. It's that conversation is always going to happen, I suppose. For me, the bottom line is, how I would describe it to my mum, is it's when a city is using technology to deliver an efficiency in environmental, social, or economic outcomes to improve the urban environment, really.
So all those things are a purpose, right? Those four things that you just mentioned are a purpose: environmental, economic, social, purpose.
Right? Yeah. And I mean, and then you just sort of put a little tiny caveat and say urban outcome, so that you're not talking about smart farms necessarily, right?
Yeah.
But I guess I feel personally, isn't that just best practice? Isn't it just business as usual now? If you aren't using the best of what's available to you to deliver efficiently and economically for communities, what are you doing? I don't care what you want to call it. Ultimately, you should always be looking for what is the best. You should know your problem, and then you should be what is the best way to solve that problem? Doing, constantly learning and refreshing. Having said that, though, when I was thinking about our chat this afternoon and I was preparing, a quote popped into my mind, which I do will out a lot, admittedly, by a mentor. A mentor of mine said it, Jeff Hayden. By the way, Jeff, if you're listening, you're a mentor. He said, there's no such thing as a smart city that isn't underpinned by economic activity. And this one's really important for me for two reasons. One, because it reminds us that someone has to pay for it. It costs money. You got to get that money, you got to get that business case, right? But the second is that if someone isn't paying for it, then communities are paying for it. The absence of it, what's happening, basically, we're at the point in the maturity of the smart city sector now where it's an important time that we can start to lift the curtain on the digital divide. There is a cost to this, a financial cost to implement it, and a cost to not doing it. And who's paying those costs? Is it the people? Is it the citizens? Because of the political cycle? Probably. So in other words, I guess just to sort of summarize that, it is, for me, smart cities is jargon, but it's divisive, and that's really the problem. So the problem for me is that, if the politician thinks that their constituency can't understand it, if they think they can't get elected on it, if they think another politician's already owned that term, they're not going to prioritise it. Unless you take a leaf out of Minister Dominello's book and you tap into this consumer demand for real-time personalised services and you badge it as customer service.
Yeah, and that's how New South Wales has been quite clever in this space, right? Because I just want to go back to your Jeff Hayden quote. I don't know Jeff, but that is exactly on point, right? There has to be an economic case for why you implement anything, and it has to be related in somehow to efficiency, right, or cost saving or enhancement of something, right? So whether that's a normal value equation, whether it's about cash, whether it's about a social outcome that you might not otherwise be able to achieve, whether it's about a wider secondary or tertiary benefit, that comes into play. And that actually goes a little bit into the whole place and precinct discussion that you and I were having earlier before the podcast started, which was that, in development now, when you look at very large precincts and you look at city and urban renewal, and you realize that there are a lot of competing priorities that we need to achieve, right? So the policy settings that are being set for us at the moment are net zero by 2050. We want, so what's that? Renewable energy, waste recycling, heating in a renewable fashion, water recycling, so on and so forth. We want to be, it's not carbon positive anymore. It's the net zero. Like that's a different target altogether. You overlay on top of that a precinct needs to be connected, whether that's via fiber or 5G or whatever that might be. You overlay that you want a precinct to not just be connected within itself, but to its surrounding areas as well. And then you overlay on top of that you want the jobs in that particular precinct or residential in that particular precinct to also have secondary and tertiary benefits. You can't then simply just zone on a very small level of building by building and expect that you're going to achieve all those targets and an amazing activated place outcome at the same time. And I think that is really impacting the way policymakers are starting to think about urbanization and urbanization precincts, which, of course, we do for a living. But most people don't really think like this, right? Most people would think, well, if I build a house, I build a house on this particular piece of land, and that's my land. What we're talking about is much bigger scale, isn't it? It's a whole precinct, or in the case of an LGA, an entire LGA, local government area for those of us who don't like to reduce things down to letters. And so I think that is an area that policymakers are struggling a little bit with, because there is a balance now between allowing development of a large-scale precinct and also meeting all these other competing demands that might come outside of the big social demands around procurement models and things like that. And I remember on our seminar, the issue of procurement model came up, and there's something I raise quite often, which is if you are in government, you're incentivized to specify things down to the last bolt, right? Because that de-risks a project for you, and it de-risks your project for your government and for your executive government, who need to be able to control the narrative and not fall into any holes that will put them off track for ages. So that happens a lot in infrastructure, which of course I deal with, right? But at the same time, if you do that, then you cost yourself all the innovation that comes from people working really hard to win a deal, and you also cost yourself all the opportunities to meet your wider policy goals. And one of the examples I always cite is in Darling Harbour in New South Wales. The government was very, very innovative in the way they put it to market. They just drew a line around the whole precinct. They said, these are the outcomes we want. We want a convention center of this size, of at least this size. We want an exhibition center of at least this size. We want a hotel of at least 3 stars. We want a urban outcome that is at least this and connects here to here. The rest is up to you. Go.
When was that? What year was that?
This was 2011 and 12 when the government did that.
Not that long ago, if you consider what's already standing in that place right now and the beauty of that precinct.
Now, look, and I should declare, I was involved in this project from the government side and then later from the Lend-Lease side. So,
I see.
I know it very, very well. But it, I was only a one part of a very large team that was involved in all that, right? But what a great outcome. If you look at Darling Harbour now, it's a great place outcome, great city outcome. It's good. And I think for this, your definition of smart city, if I can call it that, is exactly what's been lacking in this debate about smart city, because I think at the moment, everyone focuses on the tech and not enough on the place. What is the purpose of this stuff, right? What is the purpose of, that Gartner stat, there will be 50 billion internet connected devices by 2030. Yeah. I'm like, great, so what? Do I really care that my Fitbit is telling me something? Or do I really care that, what is the economic outcome? What is the purpose of this? And I think a lot of us are in the space kind of look at this, at least for me, from an investment point of view. I'm like, how does this help me? at all? How does this help me serve my citizen better? And can't we just do this by phone anyway? I mean, look at the QR code system through Service New South Wales, right? That was put in place very, very quickly. It was almost low tech, right? You print out your QR code and you stick it on the front of your shop, and next thing you know, everyone's QR coded, right? There was no massive smart city council or something to do with that. They just did it. Isn't that what a smart city is? Or is it more like we're talking about? Is there an underlying basis to the economic reasoning for how you think about a city? Is it more like how you roll out distributed renewable infrastructure, for example?
So I'm going to park just a little part. I've got two little things. And so that second part around, does it have to be connected, et cetera, I'm going to park that for one moment, because you just had something that's super exciting, I think. And I realised the irony here of us spending, 20 minutes talking about how boring it is to define smart cities, and now we're like, let's define a smart place.
Let's do it, exactly. But it's a useful discussion, so we should have it.
Yeah, I think so. But this is a very unformed thought, so it might sound a little bit non-linear. You talked about the Darling Harbour project and defining outcomes, and I've talked about this consumer demand for online service delivery and how digital transformation as a thing has really driven, culminated in this type of thing. And in a way, COVID has really COVID has exponentially accelerated what was already exponential, this digital transformation. We've gone from Industry 4.0 to Industry 4.50, right? Which, if you know anything about this next generation of industry dot numbers, is the concept of responsive cities, in the sense that it's about consumer personalization and customization. Now, what's really fascinating, I think, for this conversation is that it's about the thinking. It's about it's about understanding your problem, not defining a solution, specifying the outcomes, and then collaborating to get there. So if you're a user experience designer or a service designer, a product owner who's out there designing apps, this type of thinking is how they approach technical projects. And now we're at a point in government where actually that's how we are delivering outcomes for communities. And I'm sure there's probably a lot of much more qualified people than me that could talk about this appropriately. Jordan Hatch, another person who is just incredible, if you ever get the opportunity to talk to him, who sits across that space, would be a good one. I just want to take the fact that I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm paraphrasing other wonderful people. Yeah, it's this design thinking thing that comes through. So you talked about, now I'll come back to the second point around place and control and harmonization. And when I was preparing for this conversation, I was like, what is it I like about place as a term? And then you knocked my thinking out of the water, because you said Darling Harbour, they put a box around it. And one of the things I like about places is that they don't have borders, technically, right? They are it's customizable, whether you're in Bendigo or whether you're in Singapore. A place is whatever the locality or whatever the participants or whatever the project needs it to be. So, I suppose once you're doing something, you might put a border around it. But I just thought it was really interesting, because when we think about smart cities in Australia, and you're like, I'm going to, the city of Sydney has a smart city strategy. Like, let's be honest here. When we are comparing Singapore to Sydney, around the world, most of the things that we're actually given attributed to, it doesn't come down to the LGA in the slightest. The rankings just drive me bonkers. We're talking about outcomes at the metropolitan level, and they get attributed to people who have just literally can't be. It's not physically possible to be accountable for them. So place is useful in a country like Australia, because it means that we might be able to start to consider, say, the Western Sydney Smart City Aerotropolis, where 8 councils have come together and they're doing joint procurement around innovation. That's a place. That's people understanding the power of scale and collaborating at a level that's meaningful. We know that Sydney is technically a city of 3 cities, but within each of those cities, there are also smaller networks of interaction and meaning. So this customization thing, until I have never said this aloud before because I just came up with a new word, is, I think,
innovation at its best, right?
So not only do places not have borders, they also don't come with imported or ready-made governance structures. So this is kind of cool and important, right? So as we define and grow and iterate places based on the collectives, we either decide to just be a community or a collective, or we have to actually think, do our current governance structures meet the needs? Do we need to create a new governance structure? So then let's say you have a precinct you're responsible. Everyone has a precinct. Everyone has a special activation precinct palooza. Everyone's like, oh, we're the best at these 5 things that my neighbour said that they're also the best at. And we know that a smart city or a smart place ultimately needs to be underpinned by economic activity. You actually do need to get some governance structure in there to help align and direct those flows and that fund and that sequencing of how are you going to, do you have the connectivity in place? Which anchor tenant is going to be your core provider? Do you have the right connectivity for the type of industry that you want to grow and foster within your precinct, et cetera, et cetera? So I did say this was a non-linear thought process, but I guess what I'm wanting to really come down on as a small point for why I think place is a better word than city for smart places is that I'd love to stop comparing Sydney to Singapore or Sydney to London. Sydney is not one metropolis type thing, and this applies for any capital city. Realistically speaking, if we can't understand who is accountable for the outcomes, we're never going to be able to nudge the dial.
Yeah, I completely agree, right? And let me pick up on a couple of points, right? So I really love the concept of thinking about this on a place level and not a, LGA city-based level, because I don't think you need, in terms of a smart technology, has to be focused on the citizen and where the citizen is based, right? So it's the purpose that we're really focused on. So in the case of the border discussion, right, that works from a procurement standpoint in the sense that the border in that case was the land that was available to do this deal on, but the place was not exclusive to that border, right? It was your deal is within this border. You have to deliver the product that we wanted within this border. But part of the task has to be that you're going to stitch yourself into the rest of the community as well, right? So if you had a border around, let's say, the Darling Harbour site, that sort of, once you walked off it, your phone dropped out.
Yeah.
That'd be pretty hopeless, right? Or once you walked off it, the tiles would be different between where your border is and the next one, which I have seen projects do. Embarrassingly, there is a project very known to us where literally, because there were 2 different contractors, the design of the tiling, even though they were kind of the same color, literally changes between the end of one proponent's project and the beginning of the other proponent's project. And they don't match. And you're like, how on earth does something like that happen?
It's above and below, isn't it? So it's like,
yeah.
If you want to enhance something, bring the collective of stakeholders together, define those outcomes that you're trying to achieve, understand problems, and then collectively
deal with it. And that's your governance point there that I think is really important. And that's why I like the 8 councils thing, because it's impossible to get councils to talk to another. We talked about, state by state, hurling abuse at each other. Councils are just as good at doing that, and local officials are just as good at doing that. Those people in Council X, our trucks are newer than theirs. You should come live in this LGA, right? There was one LGA I lived in. Actually, I always laugh about this. In the inner west, that these signs up must have been from when these things were popular. It said nuclear-free zone, right? And the council had passed a resolution that this particular LGA was a nuclear-free zone. And I thought to myself, okay, I could just see the missile coming and turning up at this LGA border and going, oh, geez, nuclear-free zone. We'll have to go around to get to our target. Anyway, so I think that point's really important around that. And then the one I really wanted to drill down on was, and I think that's why we're having this discussion, is purpose, right? So the purpose of a place becomes more and more important. So where I get excited around smart technology is around purpose. So in a large urban precinct, the number one thing people need is connectivity, and that means your phone is basically your personal connectivity device now. It's more than who makes phone calls these days. I do, but I'm still somebody who likes to make them. But most people text, or they use WhatsApp, or they now apparently the millennials are sending each other video messages.
They like those voice. Yeah,
it's like a thing. Well, I don't know. One of my team sent me that the other day. I'm like, really? Like, what the hell is this?
Unless it comes with subtitles, I'm not watching.
Yeah, that's right. So these little things, right? So I think purpose. So where I get excited around it is, if you're in a precinct what kind of technology really helps you. And there, I think you're seeing a lot of app-based precinct, app-based stuff, people sharing capability. I noticed between companies the other day, they allow people to see what type of skill sets people have, and that's allowing them to contract differently. So you can go on an app and say, I need a lawyer. Well, hey, there's a law firm in this precinct. Oh, look, partner X is a specialist in blah. Oh, I can just send partner X a message. Hey, partner X, I'm in this building and I wanted to have a chat about this, right?
Partner X is in lockdown and working from home in North Rock.
That's right. So you sort of gig economy style, almost coming to a big corporate. That's kind of stuff that's evolving on its own. That doesn't require government attention, right? But where you can see government attention come in is for a wider type of purpose. So when I was a young consultant, I had the privilege of working for SMRT, so the Singaporean version of MTR. And they had a really cool bid. They had to rebid for the right to provide the bus service that hooked up to their rail service. And back then, this was 4 million years ago. They already had a requirement where they had to be able to show that a passenger that got on the bus would be served within a period of time with an interconnected timing board. The bus would arrive. They should be able to get into the shopping center, do their shopping. This is before internet shopping, and get on the train, get on the light rail, and return home within a certain time period. And that was the brief. And that means you had to have a real technology interconnection between the ability to predict where the bus was going to be, traffic flow, how long somebody might dwell in a particular place, how long the train timetable was linked, and how was that linked in the timetabling, and the light rail too, right? That to me is a smart city. That is, that's where this question of governance that you're putting into play comes in. And it goes to your point around standards, which we were talking about a bit, right? So if we set if we put our public policy hats back on and we take elements of that Darling Harbour example, and if we say, all right, we are not going to be responsible for doing anything. That's not what government is particularly good at, really. But what government is good at is setting expectations for what we should, as a community, be and how we should do. So that Singaporean example, there was a Singaporean government that said, I want citizens to be able to do X or Y. If we take a New South Wales example, the Premier of New South Wales said, I am mandating that everybody must have a QR code to check into a premises, and it's all going to be linked to Service New South Wales app, and that will keep us safe. That happened. Now we all use the check-in app, right? If we take another example, whether people like it or not, the federal government mandated that we should all have access to broadband, right? You can argue whether it was well done or not done or whatever, but we all have access to broadband. Well,
they didn't find it as an essential service, unfortunately.
Okay, but they did mandate that 99% of the population should be, and there is a universal service obligation for both voice and data, right?
Yeah, and it's the fourth lowest in the OECD.
Fair enough, but it's still a mandate, right? It's still a mandate.
Sorry.
So and look,
about this one.
We can argue whether it's good or, I mean, that's down to implementation, right? You can argue.
I feel quite strongly that there's an opportunity for Australia to prioritise vulnerable communities who are relying on, dare I say, satellite low connectivity during a crisis.
Sure, I don't disagree with that. But I would argue that's an issue of execution rather than the intent, right? So there's policy intent and there's execution.
I tried tracking.
No, but I think the point is here in terms of where we can think about these things from a governance perspective, drawing back that element is, I think that's where policy is critical. What do we actually want our cities to be? How do we want them to operate? And then you have a cascade down to grassroots of how it operates, how these things matter. And then you have the two elements. One is a set of standards that we expect ourselves as a modern society to be able to achieve. And then the market should be able to innovate how you deliver those things.
You just said my favorite word.
Market?
Yeah.
I was hoping it would be market.
Yeah, you've heard me say this before, but I've been saying it a lot lately. I believe that there's a market failure in smart cities. And a good example would be, to your point, around, government should set standards, government should set a vision, government has the power to do X, Y, and Z. The government is supposed to create these market enablers. But at the moment, the private sector is more mature and advanced than the government. Simple as that. Government's on a learning curve. Government actually can and should be learning from the private sector and how to actually enhance our capabilities in doing this type of stuff. And to draw another parallel would be your Singapore analogy of the network optimization and the different, methodologies that we use to really deliver that type of service.
It sounds a lot better when you say it than when I say it.
You mean you explained it simply and then I came in and started using jargon?
Touche.
In Australia, that was one of the first cities to have an app for when the tram was coming, and all these punters were like, "Yay! Look, my app says the tram's coming in 6 minutes," and then sort of lean out of the tram stop and look for the tram to come. And I think it worked for buses as well. I don't know, but the moral of that story is that it wasn't real. It was just a digital version of the schedule, because there was no below ground ICT infrastructure in place that could actually help track in real time where that vehicle was at all. So you're just looking at a digital version of the tram timetable in your app. It wasn't until an IoT device or some sort of underground connectivity that actually sewed the whole thing together that could actually deliver you real information about where was your bus or where was your tram. I always just thought that was such a beautiful analogy of the lights are on but nobody's at home or nobody's driving. And so there's a lot of goodwill out there in what we may want to achieve. And I think acknowledging perhaps that government can learn from the private sector is first and foremost when it comes down to admitting that perhaps there is a bit of a market failure around smart cities. Government expects a lot from the private sector, and the private sector expects a lot from government. And I wanted to sort of bring it back to this conversation around, it's about modern service delivery, modernization, modern government, and it's kind of like pretty cool, but actually the citizen has a lot of power here. So I hope to I'd like to see more bodies arise that represent the voice of the citizens. I'd like to see, whether it's, Reconciliation Australia or Disability Australia or Red Cross Australia, all these people who actually represent the voice of the citizens and the vulnerable sectors of society get involved in the smart cities, smart places conversation, because there really isn't a place at the moment that you can go. Like, we're going to go to Consumer Affairs and ask them, excuse me, are the citizens happy with the delivery of smart cities in Australia? Probably not.
Yeah. I was thinking the other day, there's this guy who sells the Big Issue in Martin Place, right? Great guy. His name's Jack. I always get to talk to him, or at least when you're in the city. But I sort of realized the other day, when I bought the issue, he had a little sort of square that allows you to tap and go. And I said to him, yeah, that's good. How long have you had that? He goes, oh, mate, it was... It's been a little while, but before that, it became very difficult because people stopped buying the Big Issue because they didn't have any cash, right? Cash. Who carries cash these days, right? Yeah. And so this little thing. So that to me is the type of innovation that just kind of happens regardless of government intervention, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You want to be able to. The government needs to be able to set standards for how we want to live as a community that go to things like public transport. Health and safety, like the COVID app, the ability to have a driver's license that's on your phone, so you don't have a phone anymore, right? I mean, that I remember when we did the digital driver's license and it first came up when I was in government, and Mike Pratt, who's now the Treasury Secretary, was the Customer Services Commissioner. He's like, this is a no-brainer. I don't know why we aren't doing it. When I got here and became the Customer Service Commissioner, this is like, why don't we have a digital driver's license? And the road authority at that time thought this was an outrageous concept. What do you mean digital? Like there'll be police won't be able to see it. They won't be able to check. Like, what think there's a lot of misnomers around what is the purpose of things, right? And I think that the second thing is it's also important for government not to overcook the goose in terms of how they think about when they decide what we are, what kind of standard of living we should have. That's not something a politician or a public servant instinctively knows. You've got to consult with the community. You've got to look at what our competitor cities are doing. You've got to look at what other countries are doing and take the best of all worlds and say, here's a vision of what we want to be, right? And, when we had a guy who's from Singapore on the podcast recently where I was thinking about, and I spent a lot of time, my son spent some time not sleeping. And while you're trying to settle him and put him back to bed, you have something to do. So I was playing old speeches by Lee Kuan Yew, who's the formative Prime Minister of Singapore. And he, his vision for Singapore, it was working for me. I don't think it was working for him. I had it in headphones. But he, that was the kind of thing that kind of made you go, for Singapore, we are going to set out what we want to be at a high level. This is the standard. This is the vision we want to achieve, right? That's what we're going for. So, and we want to get on the bus to get to that.
They can do that because they're a city-state. And that's a great, noble way to do it. Set a vision and then open up the kimono and invite people to come in and collaborate. But we can't do that in Australia because of the federal system. I mean, most people might not know this, but local government is not recognised as a form of government in our constitution.
No, correct.
Local government only exists at the grace and behest of the state government. So the federal government can't really do anything like that for us here. So that's why my call here is to say, I think our government needs to actually say to the private sector, what can we learn from you? Like, what are the examples that you're doing and that perhaps we might be able to consider doing? Because there's a bit of hesitancy. People are afraid, like you said, Vic Road or the Roads Authority, we couldn't possibly do this. Or, there's quite a few, there's some low-hanging fruit out there, but people need to be brave enough to make it a fairly big reform and, dare I say, to cough up a little bit of their own remit and to collaborate in that way. But I'd also suggest, because I don't want to be all serious and no fun, and the way you were describing the Singaporean challenge was like a game, really.
Yeah,
like
it was
a game.
Yeah.
Our cities are to be enjoyed. And as much as I diss the widget layer, as much as I diss all the apps, there's a really beautiful piece of technology, or a beautiful product that was developed out of RMIT under a guy called Troy Innocent. And
his last name is really Innocent?
His last name is really Innocent. I wish I could remember the name of the product. He's going to kill me. Basically, before we even all grasped that QR codes were cool, and like back in the day when everyone thought QR codes were a joke, Troy made these you ever heard of the street artist called Space Invader?
Oh, yes, I've heard of this.
So Troy made like physical QR codes that like patterned and pretty and beautiful that look like little mini tiles, and you hide them all around the city, and then you gamify for children or university students in particular, or people who don't speak English but can recognize a visual cue. They scan it and they get points every time they scan it. So that's one thing, and you can do all sorts of, that could just be a pure game. That could be something that's about community building for isolated international students. But equally, he then did another one where he put they weren't stick-on tiles this time. I think he obviously had, some sort of, I don't know what they call it when you wrap up a tram in something. It's got like a name, doesn't it? Or same as when you wrap an aeroplane in some sort of branding thing. Anyway, he covered a tram in Melbourne in this beautiful pattern. And when the tram went past, you scan it and music plays. And that was fundamentally a safety thing. The idea being everyone's on their mobile phone all the time and that you can step in front of dangerous trams. Or something to that effect. So my point is just the private sector, whether it's at the the application level, or whether it's, setting guidelines on sequencing, etc., because you're a private sector place operator like Lendlease, doing best practice in sequencing. There's a lot that we can apply if we're prepared to be brave enough. And I'd say hats off to the Department of DPIE here, planning industry and environment here, that running the Smart Places program, because they are doing a very brave approach to co-design on the $45 million Smart Places Acceleration Fund grant process, in that there's no formal process. You have an idea and then they put you in a room and they workshop it with the various state agencies and stuff. And it's kind of, it's going to have some...
It's iterative, right? That's exactly the sort of innovation we were talking about. We don't know what the answer is. We know what we know what the sort of outcomes we want to get to are, but we don't necessarily know how to get there, right? And that's why I do want to pick up on one point you made, though, about whether we can do it or not in Australia in terms of setting a vision high level. I would argue that we can, because if you look at the 8 councils have come together and said, Western Sydney, we're going to set a standard for smartness, right? And so there's nothing stopping those 8 councils saying, well, here's a set of standards that we want for Western Sydney as it becomes the next developed part of Sydney. So everybody in this area will need this. We want smart waste. We want, I don't know, right? There's nothing stopping them from doing that.
Well, okay, let's be pragmatic here. That City Deal was.
Are you telling me I'm being too idealistic with this?
I just think people are going to get bored because the City Deal was 7 years ago and we haven't got any outcomes. It's still a paddock. Like,
it's true.
Let's be real. Like, if you're an investor and you're looking for something and you want to like actually catalyze this and make this work, then you really need something that's going to have a bit of a more realistic delivery.
I totally agree on the time frame, but my point is more that they have come together and they can set a vision and they can set standards. Whether they can execute that properly, that's a different discussion, right?
They launched the Western Sydney 5G strategy this month, which is probably the closest I've seen to a place-based approach to standard development. I think they've been doing some stuff with shared infrastructure corridors as well out there. The long story short is that when it's completely public sector run, I believe the timelines are too long, either for political momentum to get that political vision that we need, or for the community to see and understand the real outcomes. So I'd actually be looking at some of the funner ones like the Sydney Science Park run by Celestino, not because they've specifically done anything profound yet, but because I really would love to see what a private sector can deliver in a time frame. Like given the right conditions. So, yeah, we've got some precedent, but at this point, I'm going to be a bit scathing here. At this point of the conversation, I would have preferred to have seen bigger outcomes. So the Internet of Things Alliance Australia did we surveyed 23 councils in Australia, including every single capital city in Australia, on the digital maturity of their smart city strategies, et cetera, to get a better understanding about who was doing what, et cetera. And if there was two key messages, one was that pilots are everywhere. We kind of all knew this, but none of them are scaling. Everybody's copying projects left, right, and centre. So, I take that back. Everybody's doing their own project left, right, and centre. So, 6 cities around Australia are all out there doing remote monitoring for water pressure in their public parks and crowd monitoring, but none of them are talking to each other. None of them have said, okay, no one goes to the Smart Cities and Suburbs project list and says, oh, okay, we spent $50 million on all those projects. What can we learn from that? Which projects should we copy? Which projects should we replicate? Which projects can we scale and expand on? Nobody's done that yet. Everyone's too busy I'm going to recreate the wheel type thing. Yeah. There's a lot of good examples out there in Australia, and I'm a little bit cross in the sense that I haven't found the right mechanism yet to help people to take those lessons learned and to catalyse them genuinely. I know that's a bit...
No, I agree. And I want to be clear is I'm not advocating the government lead the process as well, right? All I'm saying is that the government should set standards. And say, we're going to achieve this, this, and this, guys. Go and do it, right? Because I agree with you.
I don't think we can say standards. I think we should say outcomes, because standards are very...
Outcomes is much better. When I say, you're absolutely right. It's an outcomes. In fact, that's exactly what we say when it comes to infrastructure. We're an outcomes-based approach, right? It's an outcomes. What the public want for this particular thing is a road that has 3 lanes, not 2 lanes, because 2 lane, we know the traffic is going to exceed traffic projections in 50 years. So we're not widening the road, right? That was a great debate on the North Connects tunnel, for example, right? The reference case was 2 lanes. We told the private sector that we needed to be 3. They bid back 3, right? Same thing, right? Same thing with the Darling Harbour example we just talked about. It was an outcomes-based approach, right? Why can't that be the case with technology? Is what I'm trying to say.
This is the second key outcome from the IOTAA benchmark survey is that the number one barrier to sharing is capability, both internal sharing and external sharing. Right. Government doesn't know how to do it. And that lack of capability is so pervasive that it affects all phases of the life cycle of the project, the pre-procurement, the problem identification, the pre-procurement, the procurement, but getting that business case up the flag internally, then all sorts of, augmenting our own processes, etc. So like a good example would be like at the moment, a lot of procurement rules if they rule out participation. So if you potentially involve somebody in a pre-procurement pilot, they can't then bid for the bigger chunk of money. And here we are saying don't prescribe the outcome, don't prescribe the solution. We're saying define the problem, set the outcomes, and here's the collaborative.
Let the market tell you how to get there the best.
Yeah, but our processes aren't there, because we don't have the capability yet to really articulate the importance of all this kind of stuff. So there's a lag in capability within government. I'd also argue that there's a real lack of funding to address that capability uplift specifically. I'd point to the UK and their models around either the catapults or even, dare I say, the partnership between Digital Built Britain and Cambridge University around public sector funded, academically hosted, and the private sector led training and development. And that training and development circle then happening inside a live government project, preferably a big infrastructure project. So the government saying, we're going to pay for you guys to figure out and do a bunch of training and development on standards and policies, etc. We're going to give you access to our project's dirt. And then if your work is useful, is meaningful, then we will try to mandate it. Now, obviously, the UK analogy is difficult because in the UK, BSI is government owned. And in Australia, Standards Australia is a separate entity. But they're doing some great work. And ultimately, the only way we're going to address that lag, the only way we can really address that market failure is have a different conversation between government and the private sector about how we're going to do it together.
And how do we get there, though? How do we get there with that conversation? Because, I mean, would you say that the Smart Places team, for example, in New South Wales, I think they're trying to do that, right? Is that enough? Like, what do we need to do? You've got your alliance that's come together. You've got the Smart Cities Council. You've got sort of the beginnings of industry associations. You've got big corporates like us who are trying to figure out, but when I say us, we're Lend-Lease, trying to figure out how we can continue the large-scale urban placemaking outcomes focused, not just on technology, but on planning, on how you get to sort of different outcomes without specifying things down to the last bolt, right? What else do we need to do?
I think we're going to have to take a top-down and a bottom-up approach simultaneously. So, yes, a lot of the amazing work that's happening in Australia's first smart state, I know I'm a Victorian and I just said it, New South Wales is Australia's first smart state. A lot of the work here could
Wasn't Victoria the one with the license plate that said smart state?
I'll judge them on the outcomes. That's all I'm going to say. No.
I think they meant it from an education perspective, but anyway.
Okay. Yeah, so like obviously, testing these things out and, the Innovate Councils and the Western Sydney 5G strategy and of course the Smart Cities and Suburbs strategy is a good example. These are all effectively bottom-up approaches. This comes back to that conversation about the federal government, like, will there be more money? Can there be more money? If so, really, like, which are the key sectors that need to start sort of, dare I say, giving up some remit in order to make the pie bigger for everybody? And I would be looking fair and square at the ICT sector. I'd be looking fair and square at the health sector. I think there's a lot of outcomes that Australia can deliver in health and education if we can better combine ICT and infrastructure. Australia's policy is coming out on the 3rd of September. There's been a public commitment to publish something before the end of this year on a bit of a digital by default approach to infrastructure, et cetera. But this is just policy recommendations. Ultimately, it's going to be up to the departments and the government to adopt those and to fund them and appropriately resource them.
So what is actually good? What does good look like? Anyone in Australia anywhere likes to say, okay, well, that's our target. That's what we should be like. Is there an example where we should be looking at, we're going, wow, that's what we should do?
Are you moving me towards our Dijon conversation?
I am. Okay, did you like that lead-in? It was pretty good, I thought, right?
I did, but I want to caveat that by saying that I don't necessarily want to say that this is the best and this is what everyone should do.
Fair enough.
What does good look like? And I just think, to your point about purpose and technology, it should be technology for good. It should be, purpose should be for good. Good looks like trying to do good. Like, honestly, like when we implement a technology, anything, ask yourself, what else could this deliver? If you're implementing, I don't know, you want to upgrade your car parks or your roof infrastructure, et cetera, like that, and you're putting some sort of digital solution in, whether it's solar panels or whether it's lighting, et cetera, ask yourself, could this deliver safety enhancements? Could this data that's being generated here help generate, better insights into people movement? There's so many sort of ancillary benefits that come from a smart city project that are discounted and devalued and not built into that business case. So, what does good look like? It's grasping those ancillary benefits and packaging them up and really getting the most bang for your buck out of them and dare I say, measuring them and then monitoring them. But a good example of a place that has started to do this, we're doing it pretty well, is in the metropole of Dijon in France. And I was, reflecting on our last chat in preparation for today's call, and I was really candid, and I'm going to do it again. I'm going to say it. I've slammed already in our conversation tonight command centres. I just thought they were such a joke. This word command centre, it was just so jarring, and I just had all these visuals.
Sounds militaristic, doesn't it?
Yeah, like a bunch of men in a dark room watching cameras that might not be actually attached to anything, and just a bit sort of, Orwellian and no outcome. Anyway, so with this attitude about command centres in my mind, everyone was always talking about the Dijon smart city, and I was always like, really? Okay, well, fine. And the Dijon Metropole Smart City project, that's world-winning awards, is underpinned by this command centre that's been delivered by Suez. And I was very, very fortunate enough to be able to work or be invited by Suez Australia to go to Dijon in France. We were already there we're already in Europe, something else, and they said, yes, come to Dijon and we'll open the door sort of thing. And they took myself as a city and Peak Bodies and Adam Beck from Smart Cities Council along to see this command centre. And I was like, I wanted to do it because I was like, when you dislike something as much as I disliked command centres, I really wanted to sort of prove myself right. And I was just so wrong. I was just so wrong. So on Dijon Metropole connected 23 municipalities with a combined population of 260,000 people. So that is the size of the population of the LGA of the City of Sydney in a much bigger area. And they've been deploying multiple technology enablers, streetlights, fibre, data integration, etc. And they've co-located their ambulance, traffic, fire, police in one building with a bunch of cameras. And they're all sort of segmented off against each other because, of course, there's some things the police do that perhaps, the parking inspectors don't need to know about type thing. But it's a big donut shape. And when we arrived, there was a traffic incident. And literally unfolding in front of me, we did a big loop and they watched. We got to watch this incident from the call centre when it came in.
Wow.
We got to watch the traffic people pull up bollards out of the road and block off portions of not just the car traffic, but the public transport traffic and the foot traffic, redirect all of the signage for the public transport, let everybody know who was waiting at the public transport route that the tram wasn't coming and they had to walk 5 metres to the next one or where to go for the next one. No citizens, they got all redirected as well. And then you see the road lane prioritisation happening as the emergency services fire truck gets shot out into the traffic and the traffic lights all move and etc. And then you see them, solve the problem. And we're walking around and we see each room sort of go, oh, you're up, your turn, you're up, your turn. And then my favourite part is when they then reprioritise it. So, Australia is not actually, it's a real challenge, isn't it? It's one thing to prioritise an emergency. It's another thing then to sort of let it come back together again. And so how do you get that traffic back into the transport network, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, if you were a citizen walking around that city on that day, you would have had no idea that there was an incident that had occurred 3 blocks over. Probably wouldn't have even heard a siren. And they did it all through bollards and, cameras, et cetera, but it was just seamless, absolutely seamless. So that's one example of it in play and in operation. But the project of On Dijon Metropole demonstrated cost savings of 40% from the baseline service delivery. So a lot of that came from, city operating redundant infrastructure or cities manually having to go out and do things that they now didn't need to because they'd invested in smart infrastructure. The project is it's projected to generate more than €2 million in annual operating expenditure compared to the baseline. And those cost savings, the city is now already reinvesting straight into other funds for other smart infrastructure. So the partnership agreement was also underpinned by PPP, public-private partnership. One of the things that this is back to Meredith's obsession with B2G procurement, the partnership agreement between the private sector consortium and the Dijon Metropole is for 12 years. I think that's really important because that's how long it takes to fully absorb the cost and then realise the opportunity of that smart city investment. And another interesting thing about it was that pre-procurement phase, Jason, I got it wrong last time I spoke to you, it was 2 years. But they didn't just pop this thing out to market. They took a long time in getting that pre-procurement right, consulting with the private sector, consulting with the citizens, really, really took their time getting that one right. And so what that meant was that they could actually build in the value of the potential data into the broader.
But it also means you can help understand what the outcomes you're trying to chase are. That's what market sounding is about, right? So that procurement process you've just outlined to me sounds perfect. A strong market sounding approach to understand exactly what the outcomes are, a model, a PPP model that allows a long lease term that allows you to set a boundary around what the outcome that you're trying to achieve is, how you get it, and then the government paying rent for it, and then a renewal schedule.
They set 6 of them. So they, as a group, like before they went to procurement, they set the 6 key pillars of outcomes, and then they underpinned every single one of those to performance metrics before the procurement.
That's exactly what a PPP is meant to do, right? And, we see it in PPPs for road maintenance contracts. We see it in PPPs for, there's now one going on the Greater West for systems for Metro. We have one running on the Northwest Metro right now. That's exactly how a PPP works. But the point that you're raising there is really interesting is it sounds to me like that particular government went out and set a set of outcomes for how technology can actually improve the operations of the city.
Yeah.
That to me is a smart city.
Yeah, it's really cool.
That's really cool. And that's I think what we're all trying to get to here, right, is in discussion. It's not actually about the technology. It's about the outcome that is trying to be achieved and what can technology do to achieve it. And we're not talking about what's the things that the market can do without the government. In fact, things that the market can do without the government should just be left alone, like the creation of an app to do, go and order your coffee or something. The government doesn't need to be involved in that matter. That's not something the government needs to be involved in. How you operate the city more efficiently to get people in and out faster, to get people to live their lives in a way that has them wasting less time in traffic or being able to get home to families faster or being able to get their kids to school sooner that is exactly what the role of government in terms of an outcome is, in terms of citizen-centric technology. So I think that's a wonderful example. So we won't believe this, but we've been going for a while, so we probably should end soon. And I tend to like to end these podcasts by asking people, to sort of nominate 3 things that they would like to see. So, we've talked a lot, right? So if I was to ask you, you got your chance. Victor Dominello is listening. The Premier of New South Wales is listening. The competing premiers of Queensland, Western Australia, South Australia, Tasmania are also listening. You have 3 things to tell them about smart cities.
First one is my point around the Smart Cities and Suburbs program and taking the lessons learned. And I'd like to see perhaps either a list of problems or priority problems or a list of great projects just put up there and acknowledged as something that we should be aspiring to collectively work together on. So you could take all of the projects from the Smart Cities and Suburbs project and say, this one was exceptional. It delivered X, Y, and Z. It could be and should be copied. Like, what are the 10 top priorities for smart cities in Australia? Like, is it up to the peak bodies to say that? I mean, yeah, we can. We probably will. But, actually it'd be really lovely if perhaps the federal government could do that. They invested $50 million. So let's take your let's take your investment in that and expand it. The second one would be to continue we've seen a lot of it recently, but I always just love to really point this out, is that I'm a little bit tired of talking about smart parking. Sorry, I know that's a bit unpopular position in New South Wales. I want to talk about feeding our cities. I want to talk about water security. I want to talk about the way in which a smart city can enable citizen services in these ancillary areas.
It affects a lot more people than smart parking, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, exactly. It's e-health, it's e-education, it is just best practice governance. So I want to see the conversation expand. I want to build that business case for investment because it is, it's critical. It's I really genuinely believe that ICT needs to be an essential service for Australians. How we approach that from a regional and city perspective is a challenge, don't get me wrong, but it's a challenge that is the role for the government to address, not the private sector to address. So that's the second one. And then I just would like to see, I'm excited. The third one is that I'm excited about place and precinct-based activations, and whether we're talking about, circular precincts and completely sustainable small places where people and community come together to say that that's what they want to be, and that's what defines them, and then prioritizes it and builds the cities of the future. Like, I'm excited to see what localization in cities and people do at that precinct level. Like, I just want to encourage people to get involved. Like, where's your local urban farm? When was the last time you tried a local app to better connect with your local community? Like, there's a grassroots element to this, which I think we could have more fun with.
Well, look, there's so much there, and we've managed to talk, and unpack a lot on this topic. So, dear listener, if you're listening and you've been asking me about smart cities, I can't think of a better person than Meredith Hodgman to have on to tell you about this. You can find her at the Smart Cities Alliance.
Internet of Things Alliance.
Internet of Things Alliance. I guess I knew I'd get that wrong.
IoTAA.
Yeah. So there's lots of stuff there. Look, we're gonna have you on. There's a hell of a lot more we can talk about. But for the moment,
this is awake. Thank you.
Meredith Hodgman, thank you so much for being part of Smarter Cities. Thanks for listening to this episode of Smarter Cities. Please do subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or LinkedIn. Leave us a rating, it always helps. And tell your friends about us on social media. Intro and outro music is by Bruno E. at Public Memory. We are produced by Social Titanium out of New York. Check him out at socialtitanium.co.